Keep house, Backwoods Station. I thought I told you to get out of my station. Galactic Marshal Sterling Jennings froze at the sound of the voice behind him. He knew who it belonged to, a man that wanted him dead. You weren't kidding about that? He held his hands away from his waist and slowly turned around. The man who snuck up on him was roughly the same height, average weight and handsome face with makeup tattooed on his cheeks and eyes. It was a face made for television, and that's part of what the man did. You're about to find out how much I was kidding. He made a motion with the blaster in his hand. The blaster was a small compact model favored by the citizens in Musk, the largest domed colony on Mars, and carried by many on the streets as a form of personal protection. Sterling knew the range was limited, and if he could get 20 feet from the end of the barrel, it would do little more than cinch his shirt. The 4.5 feet distance at the moment would punch right through him. You sure you want to do this? Sterling asked. I told you to leave me alone. I told you to get away from the station. I warned you this wasn't going to end easy for you. You were just too cocky to listen. Brett, said Sterling. Can I call you Brett? Brett took a step closer and waved the pistol again. Brett, I know you work for some powerful people. The most powerful on the planet, the man bragged. And I get that. But Brett, you killed a friend of mine. He was fighting out of his league, Brett said. That market is mine. Sterling nodded and curled his lip. I don't object to the black market here. I think you know our official stance on it. You think I give a shit about your official stance? No, looking down the barrel of your piece makes me think you don't give a damn about my stance. You're damned right. Which brings me back to the fact of the matter. You killed a friend of mine. For smuggling food. Through my channels, Brett growled. That's taking money from my pocket. Your friend was stealing from me. He was feeding his family, Sterling tried. He was a thief, Brett snarled. Sterling sighed. The irony was lost on the Prime Minister's assistant. And now the man was adding assassin to his list. I heard your warning, said Sterling. Now I'm obligated to give you one of my own. You're going to warn me? The assassin sounded cocky. Sterling shifted, putting all of his weight on one leg, like he was relieving a pain in his back. You've got one chance, Sterling warned. You put your piece away and I won't shoot you. Brett glanced down at the gun in his hand and grinned at the lanky Marshal. I've got you dead to rights, he said. What's to stop me from blasting you right off your feet here in the street? Sterling moved. His hand whisked the blaster from the holster strapped to his thigh, swung it straight from the waist and sent a blast of sun-hot plasma through the heart of the man standing in front of him. Brett collapsed over backwards, carried by the force of the laser. He sprawled on the street and glared at the domed force field high above the streets of Musk. Red dust swirled across the dome in intricate patterns that were in constant change from the ever-present winds. That will, said the Marshal. Chapter 2. Sterling Jennings folded his 6'4" frame into a small chair and waited for Herman Vasquez outside of his office. It was a small space, not much larger than a walk-in closet back on Earth, and plain, much like the man it belonged to. Vasquez was a gray man. He wore a gray suit that matched his gray hair, blending in with his gray complexion. His well-trimmed mustache was gray, as were his eyes, a gift from his Russian mother. He glared at Sterling as he marched into the office and towered over him, standing in his personal space like he was a perp locked in an interrogation room. There is a shitstorm coming. A shitstorm, huh? Big shit. A metric fuckton of shit. A hurricane of shit all aimed at this office and all coming right down on top of that fucking stupid cowboy hat you won't take off. You think my hat is stupid? I think space is limited up here and nobody can bring anything up from Earth without a cost, Bart muttered through clenched teeth. I think it says something about a man who wastes that precious space just to bring up a hat. Sterling adjusted the brim of the Stetson. You're not a cowboy, you know. I know that. There are no cowboys in space. Look, Herman. You can say it as many ways as you like it. You think it ain't sinking in, but I get it. No space cowboys. Herman turned and stalked away. There's a hearing at my office in the morning with the company attorney. Leave that fucking hat in your quarters. Sterling watched him go. He reached up and tipped the hat back on his head, bemusement and annoyance battling for supremacy on his face. He wanted to shout at his bosses back but knew it would do no good. They were up against some tough odds, and he had just shot a well-known black market dealer. Frown as they might, the company relied on the black market guys to supply a lot of product they would. It kept costs down. Even if the shooting was justified. Sterling just cost them money. And the company hated to lose money. Chapter 3. Sterling stepped off the monorail from Musk onto the prefabricated printed boardwalk. He stood staring at the town in front of him. A row of buildings stretched away on either side of the main road, and he could see 2 points where it turned off onto what looked like major thoroughfares. He thought of an abbreviated cross, short on top, long down the middle, and it made his stomach clench. Too much like the place he grew up, he sighed. Nice hat, a grizzled man muttered as he pushed past him. You live here? The man spun around, fist swinging as Sterling stepped back out of reach and whipped out his blaster. You might want to rethink that, he growled. The man froze, eyes flicking from the gun to the sliver star Sterling wore attached to the holster next to it. You're a marshal, the man said, his voice phlegmy. And your fists are still up. The man dropped his hands. You always this ready for a rumble? Sterling lowered his weapon but didn't holster it, in case the man decided he needed to prove something. It's been that kind of day. If you direct me to the marshal's office, I'll let you get on with it. The man glared at him, then pointed to a space where the two roads met. Sterling nodded and backed away. The man, full of vinegar and directions, took 2 steps back and turned to hustle off. The marshal put his weapon back in his holster and began marching toward the indicated spot. It was another building, printed by giant machines that trundled in via the monorail and spat out habitat structures along the edge of the protective dome where humans dwelled. This one had a makeshift look to it, as if walls from other buildings had been assembled together by non-expert craftsmen and sealed with duct tape and hope. The front door was made of wood, a rarity on Mars, and it looked both reclaimed and salvaged. Sterling noted a boot print next to the doorknob and wondered what happened to the automatic doors. He pulled it open, blocking 3 feet of the boardwalk, and stepped inside. It didn't look much better than the exterior. It was twice as deep as it was long, one open room broken off into tiny sections. He could see bars at the back of the room, a cell block that looked cobbled together. A voice broke into his hasty inspection. May I help you? Sterling glanced down at a wizened older woman squatting behind a giant slab of table. A tinted nameplate manned one bare corner of the space that read Madge. The woman herself wore a name badge that matched the plate. I'm here to see Pete, Sterling said. You're the new one? I suppose I am. She heaved a sigh that matched the scowl on her face and rustled 3 pages of flimsy paper together. Sign here, she slid a communicator across the papers. This is your communicator. Don't lose it. We had to sell a few kidneys to get it. He couldn't tell if she was kidding. Your badge number is 1111, she continued. My old badge. I don't care about your old number or what number was on your lucky jersey or whatever you used in the past. You're 1111 now. Got it? He nodded and slipped the communicator next to the star on his belt. She glared up at his hat and opened her mouth to make a comment. Sterling Jennings, a gravelly voice bellowed across the one-room compartment that served as the marshal's office on Mars. Sterling grinned and turned to the man barreling across the floor toward him. Pete. Pete Cavanaugh only came up to his shoulder, but what he lacked in height he made up in width. He was built like a box, with wide shoulders, a wide waist, and not an ounce of fat on his thick solid frame. You look squared away, said Sterling as Pete gripped his hand with iron strength and gave it a couple of hefty pumps. I got a haircut when I heard you got transferred, the man returned the grin. Who the hell did you piss off to get sent to Backwoods Station? Nice place you got here, Sterling nodded to the simple establishment. You like Phoenix, huh? Pete let go of his hand and put his in the small of Sterling's back to steer him to the back of the room. Did they get you set up at Jamil's hotel? They did. Phoenix? Yeah, you'll find out folks around here got a real problem with authority. They've burned down our place 4 times now. 5, a pretty young black woman called from the far end of a plank of wood resting on 2 sawhorses. 5 times, Pete corrected. Here's your desk. It's a board, said Sterling. Yeah, well, we're working under a real make-do-with situation right now. Most of our budget is tied up in keeping the criminals locked up until we can transport them off-planet or to the stations. Not much left for creature comforts, Sterling observed. I told you he'd get it, Pete smiled at the woman. Sterling, this is Dominique Johnson. She's one of the 3 marshals assigned at Phoenix. This is Sterling Jennings. The woman stood up and held out a closed fist. I don't shake hands, she said. I don't know where yours have been. Sterling bumped fists with her. Mostly in my pocket. She sat back down. Hell of a shot you made according to the report. Sterling shrugged. I got lucky. You get lucky a lot. She studied him with intense dark eyes the color of coffee. According to the reports. Sterling didn't answer. We have enough trouble here, Pete. We don't need to import more. He's not trouble, are you, Sterling? At least not the kind we can't handle. A report can often miss the nuances of detail and context, said Sterling. She picked up a piece of paper in her slim hands and dropped a pair of reading glasses from her curly hair to the tip of her nose. He drew first. Hell, I figured that, said Pete. You wouldn't shoot an unarmed man. Yes he would, said Dominique. He would? Page 7, she shuffled the papers on her desk and held one out to Pete. He took it from her hand and scanned it quickly. Shit, Sterling, he was unarmed. Yeah, nuances and details. Sterling took the sheet of paper from Pete and handed it back to Dominique. He murdered a kid. 12 years old after he kidnapped and assaulted her. Dropped his weapon and surrendered to you, according to the report. Dominique studied him. Yep. We don't do the judge, jury, executioner shit around here, Sterling. We just do the job. Got it. What's with the hat? Dominique glanced up at the Stetson on his head. Sterling tilted it back. It's just a hat. Nobody's going to like it up here, she said. They're going to give you a hard time for it. I can take a hard time. Trouble, she said to Pete, as if that proved her point. Don't make anyone burn down my station, Sterling. We got enough trouble around here without you kicking a hornet's nest just to see what comes up. I'm not here for trouble, Pete. He grabbed one of the folding camp chairs that served as an office chair and set it in front of the trestle. You know what's in a hornet's nest, don't you, Sterling? Hornets? Damn right, hornets. And you know what hornets do? They sting you. I don't want hornets or stings or trouble. I don't want them to burn down our office again. Phoenix from the ashes, Sterling picked up a piece of paper. Probably not a good idea to have all this paper and wood if firebombing is their favorite pastime. They won't give us tablets anymore, said Dominique as she shuffled his file to one side and picked up another. Said we were costing too much money. Now we get printed copies we have to beg the office next door to give us. Sterling reached for one of the piles. Dominique got there first and moved it out of his way. She replaced it with a set of papers of her own that he began to shuffle through. It would be easier on a computer screen, she said. Easy to sort, filter and rank. I don't mind, he told her. I wasn't asking how you felt about it, she said. So just us three? Sterling set the papers on the wooden trestle. I don't go in the field anymore, Pete said. Then who's the third, Marshal? Only guy I know who's a better shot than you. Pete grinned and walked to another makeshift desk at the end of the room. Sterling watched him go, one eyebrow lifted in a curious stare. He noticed Dominique watching him and returned the look. Trouble, she shook her head and ducked back to the stack in front of her. Chapter 4. Boys, what we have here is a real watch-the-clock situation. Chuck Crowley stood in front of a group of men with his hands on his hips. He was 5'9" with sandy blonde hair cut short on the sides and longer on top, giving him an impressive ability to flip his hair down over his eyes or slick it back across his skull, which made him look like a different person. He leapt onto a 5-foot aluminum crate and straddled it like a platform. I don't know, Chuck, a greasy-looking tweaker rubbed the tip of his pockmarked nose with a grimy thumb. Maybe we ought to go. Leon, Chuck stared at the man with a penetrating glare. If this was a football game, would you drag your ass off the field in the middle of the third quarter? They don't play football in space, a second man offered. Chuck let his glare drift over to Jabo Johnson, his second in command, and drilled him with it. Thank you, Jabo, your words of wisdom always seek to inspire. I'm just saying, the lanky man shrugged his shoulders. He licked his chapped lips like a 12-step alcoholic stepping into a bar after a 30-day chip. And we heard you say, Jabo, thank you, Chuck continued. Now what I'm saying is we're going to wait for these nice fellas to show on up here, and we're going to get the money they owe us for services provided. Any of you boys feel a strong objection to that? But they're late. Leon scratched his elbow and forearm on his left hand in twitching spasmodic jerks. Or we're early, Chuck said. Hell, they could be watching us right now for all we know. We are, said a voice from behind the aluminum crate. Chuck spun around, ripping a blaster from the back of his pants and dropping to the floor behind the crate. The motion was so smooth and fast, his body was blocked by the bulky box before his other compatriots had time to react. 8 men stepped out of the shadows and Chuck noticed they were wearing a Camotech fabric that blended in with the wall behind them. Eric? He called out. He also saw they were armed with Army-issue space blasters aimed at his small group of men and the safeties were off. "I was beginning to think you weren't gonna show," Chuck continued. "We've been here since the beginning," one of the men called out. A gloved hand reached up and depressed a button on the uniform. The dappled pattern on the fabric disappeared, replaced by solid plain gray. Eric reached up and pushed the hood of the uniform back. "Then you heard me extol the virtues of working with you," Body said. "Would you be so kind as to instruct those men of yours to turn their weapons away from us, so we can conduct our business in a stress-free environment?" Eric barked out a laugh. It looked out of place on his ruddy face, red hair buzzed to almost the skin, giving him a skeletal look. "Chuck, you're on Backwoods Station," said the red-headed man. "If there is a stress-free spot in the universe you are now at the point farthest from it." Chuck stood up from the box. "Don't I know it, brother, but still the fact remains that a man under gunpoint tends to get a little itchy himself, and I sure would hate for us to start doing anything that could damage our relationship." He patted the metal crate. "Or this merchandise you're so keen on having." Eric nodded and made a signal with his hand, shifting his own blaster behind him. "Good point," he said. "We paid a lot of money for that product." "You paid a good deposit for that product," said Chuck. "With the balance due upon delivery." "Well, Eric, I have delivered." Eric pulled a tiny screen tablet from the breast pocket of his uniform and ran his finger across the front. Chuck's hip pocket beeped. "I do thank you," he grinned. "It was a pleasure doing business with you." Eric grunted and motioned 4 of his men to grab the aluminum crate and haul it out. There were 4 more just like it. Chuck and Eric watched them move the crates into a hover hauler, a 2-seater flat platform designed for transporting goods on Mars. "If I need a second order filled?" Eric said from the side of his mouth. "Damn son," Chuck grinned and didn't look at the man. "I can get as many guns as you want. Bigger stuff too, if the price is right. How far are you planning on carrying this little war of yours?" "None of your business," Eric snapped. "When can you get them?" 2 weeks, Chuck said. "Unless you want to pay a premium charge." 2 weeks works for our time frame, Eric said. "I'll contact you for arrangements." Eric watched the last crate slide into the back of the platform and joined his men. Jabo moved up next to Chuck as they watched the rebel group leave the warehouse. "What's that all about?" "Plans and consequences, son," said Chuck. "Come on, boys. We've got work to do for the next 2 weeks, but tonight, the celebration is on me." The men gave a short small cheer and followed Chuck toward a door at the back. Chapter 5. There were clear divisions in Backwoods Station, not quite divided by the magnetic rail track and the train that delivered goods and people to and from the main colony of Musk. The division was divided by the length of the main strip of the small town that existed on the edge of the dome. On one end, the more prosperous citizens made their home and on the far end of the stretch of the road lived the other half. There were several bars that serviced the nearly 10,000 residents of Backwoods Station, or at least those that chose to drink. They served up local hooch made by enterprising denizens who refused to pay the premium prices created by the black market. Chuck and his crew frequented Z's, one of the bars on the wrong side of town and usually occupied by a rough kind of crowd. The homebrew was cheap, the music was loud, and even if it looked like every other building on the main street, Z's still looked dirty. The tables were grimy and well-worn, the floor scuffed and gritty with tracked red dirt that no one bothered to sweep. Half of the LED strips were dark, either by neglect or on purpose, but it made the interior smoky and dim. Smoking was forbidden on Mars since they had to generate their own atmosphere. But the law was ignored in Z's. Scrubbers worked triple time to keep the air from becoming a toxic soup, but the people who came there to drink didn't seem to care. Some even seemed to think that blowing up the dome and ending their crappy existence might be better than their current state of affairs. One drinker in particular held court at the far end of the bar, though no one paid much attention to his slurred rants. He stopped complaining when Chuck stepped in and fell off the stool to stumble toward the man before he made it all the way inside. "How did it go?" He latched onto Chuck's jacket with sweat-stained hands and sent a cloud of alcohol fumes across his face. "It's good to see you too, Randall." Chuck shoved the man away and held up a tablet reader in the bartender's direction. "Get my boys a couple of rounds." The hard-jawed bartender nodded and went to work slinging drinks. "You including me in that, ain't you, Chuck?" "Why, Randy, I would no sooner forget the man that bird-dogged me the deal than I would my own mother." "I thought you were an orphan?" Randy shook his head in that confused way in the manner of one who has imbibed too much. Chuck barked out a laugh. "Randy, I think people don't give you near enough credit." He slapped the man on the shoulder to steer him back to his stool and wiped his palm on his pants. Of course your drinks are on me tonight." He motioned the bartender and showed him 3 fingers, which earned another nod. Randall was getting 3 for free. "Leon," Chuck called out. "Follow me." Leon twitched in step bedside Chuck with his free drink in hand. "I'd follow you to the end of the earth," he told Chuck. The 2 men made their way to the back of the bar. Chuck felt along the wall until the tips of his fingers found a seam. He pressed on it and revealed a hidden door that whisked open and allowed them to step out into the Martian night. A billion pinpricks of light glittered above the dome as red dirt swirled around 1,000 feet above them. There were few exterior lights in Backwoods Station and this far from musk, zero light pollution, which made the stars brilliant in the nighttime sky. Chuck adjusted 2 chairs on a small metal platform that served as a delivery area and sometimes deck for special guests of Z's. He offered the first chair to Leon and sat in the second, feet crossed at the ankle as he stared up at the stars. "You don't have a drink," said Leon. "Want me to go get it?" "Leave it, Leon," said Chuck, his voice sounding wistful. "I think I'll drink in some of this cool night air." "Ain't the temperature regulated?" Leon glanced around at the empty landscape that stretched behind him. A couple of huts dotted the far end of the street, but most of the populated dwellings ran down another street off the main drag, like the leg of a T. "It's a metaphor, Leon. I like to think that the mind is a powerful thing and that thought equals action." "That makes sense." "It does, doesn't it, Leon? Now you want to share some of your thoughts with me?" Leon shook his head and took a drink. "I don't have any thoughts, Chuck." "Now see, normally, I might believe you, Leon. I might believe that your head is a void as vast as that nighttime sky above us. As empty as that red desert in front of us." "I'm confused," said Leon. "I think it's an act," said Chuck. "I think you ain't confused. In fact, I think you know a lot more than you're letting on, and in point of fact, I think you are sharing what you know and what you suspect with people." "That's a lot of thinking," said Leon. "I don't know if I follow." "See, Leon, I think you do follow. Another fact is, as soon as I started talking to you about this, you set your drink down and that other hand of yours ain't come out from under your coat where I know you keep a little small piece for personal protection. You follow me now?" "I think you're wrong. And I noticed that your twitch, that ever-present habit you've had since the day you walked into my gang, has magically disappeared." "Chuck," Leon said as he lifted his right hand and kept his left under his coat. Chuck drew his blaster and fired a shot into Leon. The man flipped out of the chair and off the back of the metal deck, sending up small plumes of dust as he landed in the red dirt and twitched one last time. Chuck stood up from the chair and glanced over the edge. "When I find out who you've been talking to, they can expect the same," he said to the dead man. Chuck went back inside the noisy club. J-Bo met him with a drink and followed him to a table. "Where's Leon?" he leaned in and asked, working hard to keep his voice low. "Gone." Chuck took a sip. "Just like that?" "J-Bo, I could quote you some criminal code of honor here, or how a man is only as good as his word, but let me give you something to share with the boys." "What's that, Chuck?" "I'm not the man you want to go up against." Chapter. He woke up and the first thought he had was he wasn't at home. Sterling sat up in bed and looked around. It was a crappy hotel room, well worn and used in a place that saw 0 tourists per year. He rolled up out of bed and sat both of his feet on the floor. First things first. Coffee. There had to be coffee somewhere in this place. It was one of the first things they shipped in. Construction workers needed the nectar of the gods to slap up the instant cities, and people who lived in those cities needed it to go about doing whatever work that was required of them. He went into the bathroom and prepared himself for the first day at work. The man looking back at him in the mirror had been handsome once upon a time. Maybe. A few women had told him so. In the past. Now there were more wrinkles around the eyes, frown lines on the edges of his mouth. Gray hairs at his temple that a kind person might call distinguished. He thought they made him look old. Older. But he was still fast. Except right now. Last night's Sola celebration left him feeling a little like death warmed over this morning. That's okay, he'd felt like it before and coffee helped. He finished dressing and checked his weapon. It could use a good cleaning and he made a mental note to do it once he reached the station. The blasters were created specifically for use on Mars, but the red dirt still seemed to get into the crevasse designed to air-cool the light element that ignited the blast. A hint of a smell struck his nostrils and he smiled. He locked the door behind him as he left the one-room hotel room and followed his nose. "Coffee?" The man behind the desk pointed. I recognized the look on a fellow addict's face. Sterling grabbed a cup and filled it full of black liquid, then splashed a little creamer in it to take the edge off. If it wasn't quite perfect, it was still damned good, and he stood and stared through the window while he finished the first cup. The clerk behind the desk was named Jamil according to a small plastic name tag pinned to his chest. Sterling thought he looked buttoned up and spiffy for a man running a 6-room flophouse 1 block back from the main strip. Jamil was a man who looked like he wanted to go places. "Who you planning to catch today?" Jamil asked without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. "Whoever they send my way, I guess. When I first came out here, I didn't see much use for a GM station," said Jamil. "But you guys cover a lot of ground." "That a fact?" "Part sheriff, part cop, and seems like a little bit more of everything else thrown in." "Protect," said Sterling. "And serve. You like it?" Sterling considered the question for a moment. A lot of people became a galactic marshal because of a sense of justice. The law needed good stewards to fight off the bad men who preyed on society. He wasn't in it for justice, although that might play a small part in it. He joined the GM after a stint in the war, after watching a lot of good men die in the colonization of Mars. He was handy with the blaster, and that helped. "It's a job," he answered. But it was more than that. He liked helping people, and he liked thinking he made a difference in keeping the world safe. And there was a part of him, one he was scared to admit, that liked killing people. Not that he enjoyed it, far from that. He liked the fact that he killed bad men and their absence made the planet a better place. "Half the time it's just babysitting," he told Jamil. "And the other half?" "Waiting to babysit," Sterling said and finished his cup. "Thanks for the coffee." "It's out every morning," said Jamil as he adjusted the knot on his thin tie. "Part of the service." "Keep it up and you'll go places," Sterling tipped his hat. "Have a nice day." "You too, Marshal," the man behind the desk answered. "Can I ask you a question?" "You just did." "That's an old joke." "I've got an old soul." "What's with the hat?" "Sometimes, Jamil, a hat is just a hat." "I don't think people around here are going to like it," Jamil said almost under his breath. "Lucky me," Sterling said as he stepped through the whisking door. He was suddenly craving something a little stronger than coffee, and it wasn't even past morning yet. Movement out of the corner of his eye caught him off guard and he tipped sideways, sliding one foot out and ripped his blaster from the holster on his thigh. A pretty woman with wide gray eyes froze on the walkway and held up both hands, shock making her skin go white. "Oh," she gasped. Sterling stared at her for a microsecond, let his eyes flicker around. They were the only two people on the street. "You startled me," he said as he lowered his weapon. "Do you startle easy?" Sterling shrugged. She was a stunning woman with blonde hair, intelligent eyes that sparkled like she was in on a joke he had yet to catch up on. It added to her attraction. "I might be a bit jumpy," he confessed. "Jamil makes his coffee strong." She stepped around him. "You'll get addicted." "I may be already." "Then I'll watch my step around you, Marshal." He lifted his head, eyes going hard for a moment. "I saw the star," she explained. "Good with details?" "Among other things. You'll have to excuse me, I'm late." She pushed around him. "I didn't catch your name," he called after her. "No, you didn't," she said and slipped around the corner of the next building to the main strip of Backwoods Station. Chapter. "Glad you decided to come in today," Dominique said without looking up from the stack of papers in front of her. "It's my first day," Sterling said as he searched the room. "Help you find something? Don't you have a coffee maker or replicator?" "Had," she said. "We requisitioned a new one and it's due to be delivered in one of the next 3 shipments." "You do all of this without that?" "I stop by Jamil's on my way into work and he gives me a thermos." She tapped a vacuum cylinder next to her stack. "He makes the best coffee in the station." "That's the best?" She nodded without looking up, eyes studying the page in front of her. Pete stepped away from his desk at the back of the room. "Glad you made time for us today, Sterling." "It's 0800, the Marshal answered. "Dominique's been in since 6 o'clock and I dragged ass in at 6:30. If I'd know you were a late riser, I'd have given you the night shift." "Got it," said Sterling. "Well, now that you're here we can get down to business. Where's the other guy?" "Which other guy, Sterling? You'll have to be more specific." "The better shot than me." "Told you it would bug him," said Dominique. "It doesn't bug me," said Sterling. "I was just looking for the whole team." "The other guy prefers if you use his name." Pete grabbed a file from the top of a stack. "You never told me his name," Sterling said. Otherwise I would have asked where is Tim? His name isn't Tim, said Dominique. I was using an example. Are either of you going to share this mystery man's name or is it a secret like his location? Tim covered a homicide overnight and he should be in shortly, said Pete. I thought you said his name wasn't Tim. It's not. I just didn't want you to get confused. He seems easily confused, Dominique observed. I don't know if you're just messing with me or if you really are serious, Sterling glared at them both. Not much at detecting either, Dominique glanced up and he saw the hint of a grin at the corner of her mouth. Pete shoved the file in his hand over to Sterling. That homicide last night belongs to you. Not Tim? Sterling flipped open the file and began to thumb through the thin pages. We don't have a Tim that works here, Sterling, keep up. The doors to the street whisked open and admitted a compact athletic-looking man with a silver star hanging on a chain around his neck. His eyes roamed across the room, taking it all in, and landed on Sterling. Speak of the devil, said Pete. Tim the devil, Sterling held out his hand as the man marched to the trio with tight precise steps. Who is Tim? The man shook hands. Warren Doggett. Sterling Jennings. Sterling appreciated the way the man didn't try to grip his hand too hard to prove how much stronger he was, or in some adolescent dominance contest. Warren was a head shorter than he was, but wider in the shoulder and not quite as narrow in the hip. He stood like a man who owned the place, and Sterling supposed that if he was as good of a shot as Pete claimed, he would. They bring you up to speed? I think they're on speed, Sterling answered. Yeah, Jamil's coffee will do that to you. We had a shooting last night that was odd. A woman shot her husband. Claimed it was self-defense. What's odd about that? She waited for him at the door and when he opened it, blew him back into the street. Sterling tilted his head side to side as he ran some calculations. Depends on the angle, the trajectory and where she hit him, but I've seen a man blown off his feet before. Blown out of his boots, knocked sideways like the strings holding him up got cut. Maybe just getting shot does odd things to the body. It was the ambush she was referring to, Dominique interjected. No, I get that, Sterling said. I'm still waiting to hear the odd part. Odd part is he's got a brother and a family that's known for revenge killings, whether the wife-beating son of a bitch deserved it or not, said Pete. He hit her? 18 reports in the file, said Dominique. You should read it. Sounds like he got what he deserved. Probably. But now the Crowley clan is hot and bothered to get her before word gets out and folks think they've gone soft. Others might start taking shots at them too. Pete moved back to his desk. You're pulling guard duty. Sit on her, keep her safe. Sterling glanced at Warren. You got an address? Chapter. What do you want? Did they send you here to arrest me? Sterling tilted his hat back and stared at the woman standing in the doorway. She almost took his breath away. Ava Crowley? A head shorter than he was, she wore a thin dress that served to accent her muscular shoulders and graceful neck. She had a dark mass of red curls that cascaded around a smooth round face, sparkling green eyes that watched him with an intense passion. He could see the hint of anger in the set of her jaw, as if all it would take is the right spark to ignite a blaze of rage. Sterling Jennings, Galactic Marshal Service. I figured you were a lawman, she sneered. You look like one. Most people think I look like a cowboy, he said. The sneer slid to a grin and back again. There's no such thing as a space cowboy. That's what I say. Is it now? But I'm not a cowboy, I'm a marshal. You said that. I'm here because you killed a man. My husband, she said. It was self-defense. She crossed her arms under her chest. He tried not to stare. I'm not here to take you in. Then what is it? That man's brother is planning to kill you. He doesn't want to kill me, Marshal, she smirked. He wants to fuck me. Does he? She swung a hip from one side to the other. It did interesting things to the dress. You think there's something wrong with that reason? You did kill his brother. His brother liked to play a game with me, she said and stepped back into her living quarters. You want to come in for a drink? I was going to wait out front, said Sterling. You get protective custody. You can protect me in here better than out there, she said and stepped into the room. She left the door open. Come on in. Sterling went through the door and pulled his hat off. The inside of the small hut that Ava called home was well appointed and Spartan, like most of the dwellings in the Martian colony. The walls were the same beige color of poured polycarbonate as the day they were created. They lacked decorations, the price for transport too high for the majority of colonists to care much for aesthetics. Sterling thought there was a certain appeal to the lack of pictures, paint and other touches that he had grown accustomed to in Musk. The absence of amenities didn't extend to alcohol though. "Fix you a drink?" Ava swished to a shelf built out of the wall and grabbed one of several bottles of clear liquid. "What's with the hat?" "It's just a hat." She didn't wait for an answer but proceeded to pour out a couple of shots into 2 glasses and held one out to him. He took it and quaffed a swallow of the homemade liquor. "I was going to make fun of you not drinking on duty," she said. "I don't turn down free booze," said Sterling. He moved across the room and placed his back against the wall to get a clear view of the door. He held his drink in one hand and rested his other hand on the handle of his blaster. She took a smaller sip and steadied him. "How's your drink?" "It sucks." She snorted. "The good stuff is too expensive. You can get the homemade stuff cheap." "That a fact?" "Fact is you can get a lot of stuff around here cheap if you know the right person to ask." Sterling glanced at the Spartan interior of her living room. "You know the right people?" "Person," she said. "I shot him." "Your husband was the guy." She shrugged her beautiful shoulders. "He was one of the guys." "A guy?" He knew how to get this. She sloshed the liquid in her glass. "Among other things." "You going to tell me what some of those other things might be, or you gonna just keep me guessing?" She didn't answer, just took a sip of the hooch and tried not to blush as it burned its way down. "Do you know how to get things, Marshal?" He took a drink to hide a grin. "I get the job done," he said. "Ma'am." "Ma'am? Damn, Marshal, that makes me feel old." "You don't look it," said Sterling. "And I was just being polite." "You're not in a polite society," she told him. "You mind if I take a shower? I mean you can still guard me, if you want." "I can guard just fine from right here." "Suit yourself." He watched her swish across the floor and almost spit his drink on her polished prefab floor when the dress dropped halfway across the room. He didn't look away as she sashayed the rest of the distance and glanced back over her shoulder before she stepped into the little bathroom alcove. Sterling spied a smirk before she slid out of view, and he shook his head. Whoever Miss Ava Crowley was before, she was trouble now and he knew it. He was trying to ignore the part of his brain that demanded he storm the bathroom to ensure her safety when her front door whisked open and a greasy-looking short man stepped inside. He took 4 steps across the floor, fumbling up a modified blaster before he caught sight of Sterling and nearly dropped the weapon. He caught it at the last second before it spilled out of his hands, but the barrel was aimed at his head. "Who are you? What the hell are you doing here?" the man squeaked. Sterling stood up and dropped his hand to the holster on his leg. "Maybe a better question is what are you doing here? Is the lady expecting you?" Sterling began to wonder if the woman put on a show for him, but he was the warm-up act before her true paramour appeared. He hated the surge of jealousy that tickled the pit of his stomach and made his finger trigger itch. "Where's Ava?" the man squeaked again. Sterling let his other hand swish back the hem of his coat with the glass of homebrew to show the silver star clipped to his belt. "I'm going to ask you again," he said, a dangerous edge to his voice, skin tight around his eyes. His body was motionless. "Is the lady expecting you?" "Hell no, she ain't expecting me. What do you think?" The short twitchy man let his eyes dart back to the bathroom, to the star on the belt and back again. "She in there?" "Fella, I'm gonna ask you to put that weapon down so we can talk without too much worry of you getting shot." "What you got there?" the short man sneered. "Holstered P-blaster? Hell, I got a modified right here aimed at your face. Think you can outdraw me?" The intruder lifted the blaster and aimed it at Sterling. It took a second for him to realize the barrel was pointed at his own face, the handle backwards and the trigger, if not quite out of reach, then too awkward to pull. "Son of a bitch," he groaned. "Yeah, it's gonna be that kind of day." Sterling slid his blaster out and had the right end pointed at the man. "Put that down and tell me your name." "Desi," the man squeaked as he leaned forward and put the rifle on the floor. "Don't shoot me, mister." "Marshal," Sterling corrected. "Don't shoot me, Marshal." "I ain't gonna shoot you." Sterling took 3 steps closer to Desi and kicked his rifle across the room. It spun around twice and hit the wall. "I'm gonna ask you again. Are you expected?" "Hell no, he ain't expected," said Ava from the bathroom door. She gripped a towel across her skin that did a piss-poor job of hiding her, as if it was almost too narrow to cover her top and bottom at the same time. She crouched forward to compensate, which almost made it worse. "You know this man?" Sterling asked. "Desi Micah," she sneered. He used to work with my husband. I still work with him, Desi objected. No you don't, said Ava. I killed that son of a bitch on account of him thinking I was his punching bag. And if you don't get out of my house, I'm going to kill you too. Now hold on, said Sterling. Ava dropped the towel and grabbed a blaster from the bathroom. Sterling had a second to wonder if that was the real reason she went for the shower and if the shot was truly meant for him before she aimed at Desi and squeezed her eyes shut tight. The Marshal dove across the room and tackled the intruder to the floor as a blast seared the air above them. Ava pulled the trigger again with her eyes still closed and the shot went wild into the space above the front door. Sterling tucked his arms and rolled across the floor. He plowed into her shins and spilled her over backwards. She landed with a painful plop and lost the gun as he scrambled up her still damp body and knocked it free. He grabbed both her wrists in his hands and held them over her head while she squirmed under him and finally opened her eyes. "Well hello there Marshal," she grunted and finally stilled. "You planned this?" He groaned and adjusted himself on top of her, trying to get leverage with his knees without letting go of her hands. The rifle was still just right there. "You on top of me by the end of the night?" "Can't say the thought didn't cross my mind." She curled a foot around his calf and smirked up at him. "I'd tell you to get a room but that'd just be a waste of my breath," Desi said standing over them. Sterling looked up. The modified blaster was pointing down at the couple on the floor. "I'm gonna have to ask you to put down the weapon," Sterling said. "And I'm gonna have to ask you to fuck you Marshal," Desi pulled the trigger with a clack. "Safety's on," the Marshal pointed out. "Shit," Desi fumbled for the safety catch. Sterling twirled off Ava, yanked her blaster up and beamed the intruder's head into a million vaporized particles that drifted across their feet. He sat up as the body flopped over backwards in a smoking sprawl. Ava sat up next to him and stared at the mess. "Shit," she sighed. "I just cleaned them floors." Chapter. "Sterling, I think you're messing with me. I think you're sitting there having fun at my expense." Pete's face was red. Color blossomed from the collar around his neck and crept all the way up to where his forehead disappeared into hair. "I don't like it when people have fun at my expense. Because there is no way in hell I'm going to believe for one damned minute that you shot a man while you were under investigation for shooting another man." He broke in. "Pete. He was going to shoot me." Sterling sat on the couch by the front door as Medic wheeled a headless body out on a floating gurney. "As good a shot as you claim to be, you couldn't have winged him?" "I tell you Pete, I wish I would have thought of that. But he had us dead to rights, and if he knew how to click a safety, you might be wheeling me out instead of him." "I wish they were wheeling you out," Pete almost screamed. "Do you know how much paperwork I'm going to have to do on this? And it's real paper Sterling. They won't let us have tablets. This file is going to be a mile thick." Sterling motioned after the body. "I bet you pulled his sheet you're gonna find he was a lowlife no account and nobody is going to give a damn whether he's gone or not." "That ain't the point," said Pete. "You said no trouble. You were supposed to keep your head down and your nose clean, and instead, I have to come find you at a known killer's house with another dead body." Pete held up two fingers to show him. Ava stepped out of her bedroom, and Sterling was glad she was dressed and a little subdued. "That man came over here to kill me," she said to Pete. "And your man saved my life. He's a hero and you're sitting there yelling at him." "Well little lady, I'm not sitting here yelling, I'm standing here yelling because that's the only way to get you to listen." Pete frothed. Sterling held up both hands. "I'm listening." "Are you? Then hear this. I'm gonna have to suspend you while we investigate this. You're off duty as of this moment, you hear me? I don't want you anywhere near any of this till we get the whole damn thing sorted out." "You want my badge?" Pete let out a breath and a lot of anger with it. "No, just don't go whipping it out until you're back." He glanced at Ava as she sat on the couch in front of him. "And don't whip out your gun. And don't whip out anything else either. In fact, it's just a damned good idea if you keep everything where it's supposed to be, holstered and unused. You got me?" "It was kind of subtle there Chief, but I think I get your meaning." Dominique stepped into the room and motioned Pete over. She glared at Sterling while she waited. "Trouble," she growled. Sterling shrugged as he leaned back into the couch. It was one of the 3D printed models. The company shipped them over by the crate, which allowed for mass production down on the planet, and while it kept the costs low, it kept the comfort practically non-existent. "You going to listen to him?" Ava asked, tilting her lovely head in his direction. "About my badge? Yes." "And your gun?" She lifted her chin. Her neck was a delicate line, a treasure trail to enthralling places. "That too." "Anything else?" She grinned. Pete saved him from having to answer. "All right, Sterling," he said. "We had a file on your perp that was pretty thick. Your suspicion of a lowlife up to nefarious doings may hold up." "He pulled first," said Sterling as he pushed off the couch. "You want me to pull night duty to keep Miss Crowley safe?" "Hell no, I don't want you to do your duty on Miss Crowley. You're suspended, remember? Just thought I'd offer. Offer to go home. Offer to go away. Dominguez's got the night shift on protection detail." "Ma'am." Sterling put his hat on his head and ambled toward the door. He tried to ignore the daggers that Dominguez shot at him for the extra duty, and mostly succeeded. Chapter. "Sorry to hear about your brother." "Yes, Jabo, it was a tragedy," Chuck answered. "But the rumor mill is at Twitter with another tragedy. Your friend Desi is no longer of this world." "Shit." "Shit is right, son. There's a new marshal in town and he shot him when he went to Ava's home." "Damn, man, that was my favorite gun," said Jabo. "That was your only gun." "That's why it was my favorite." "Be that as it may, we find ourselves with another problem." Chuck let Jabo ponder it for a few moments. The man was loyal, which was good, but he also had a preponderance for slow thinking. It wasn't that he was stupid, though not too far from it. It just took a little time for the words to work through the gears and arrange themselves in a way that made sense. If he hadn't been so loyal, and backed him in several tight pinches, Chuck would have cut him loose from the Conway Commandos a long time ago. "We have to kill the Marshal," Jabo finally arrived at it. Chuck nodded. "Yes, I would like the man dead, if only for the inconvenience he has caused us. But Jabo, you know what would happen if we killed the GM?" Jabo shook his head. "We burned down the station and they didn't do shit about it. They can't do a damn thing." "They can and they will. Plus that rumor mill I mentioned? The buzz is this here Marshal is the same fast-draw son of a bitch that killed that Mars mafioso in Musk." Jabo's eyebrows crinkled up as he processed this new information. Chuck could almost see the gears turning in his mind, the wrinkles around his eyes moving as each thought popped up and popped out. "We could sell him out to the mob." "That's one way to do it," said Chuck. "A little tip to get us in the good graces of one of the more powerful gangs. I'm glad you thought of it." Jabo beamed at the unexpected compliment. The truth was, Chuck had not only considered the possibility of ratting out the Marshal's location, he was sure the mob already had that information. He wanted to cover his tracks and make sure he was confirming it for them. Sure, it was brown-nosing, but it never hurt to let the big guys know he wasn't trying to hide anything. They smiled kindly on favors. "You want me to reach out?" "Hell no, Jabo. I want you to get started on the next order for Eric the Red. He's got something in the works and we're going to be his #1 supplier for that party." Chapter. Sterling took a cup of coffee out on the boardwalk and nursed it as the weak sunlight filtered through the dome. Swirling dust made animated shadows flicker like living things as they formed, broke up and changed shape again and again in the red-tinged dawn. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with himself. 24 hours into his new posting and he was suspended. Maybe just long enough for Pete to cool down and bring him back into the station for another ass-chewing, which he could handle. But what if it was longer? The bitter liquid burned going down and spread warmth out from his stomach. He could feel the caffeine kicking in, slow at first, but ratcheting up level after level as his senses came alive. If he was out, then he couldn't go back to Musk. The man he had killed had powerful friends, and they would come hunting for him, that much he was sure. Just as sure as he was that he could kill anyone who tried. Except he wasn't sure how far justifiable homicide would go with a self-defense theory absent his badge. A good prosecutor could have a field day with his propensity to shoot fast and usually first. That thought gave him an epiphany that made him chuckle. There were two sides to every story, and somewhere in between the truth, and it depended on which version a person chose to believe. "Does something strike you as funny this beautiful Martian morning?" a feminine voice said from the corner of the building. "You just caught me mid-thought," he explained as he stared at the beautiful woman with gray eyes. "If this is going to be a habit, I'll have a cup ready for you." "That's much better than what's a girl like you doing in a place like this," she said as she slowed down to pass him. "Well?" He waited. She paused for a moment. "Doctoring," she said. "Though that's being kind this far out." "You," he started to say. "Don't look like a doctor? Have an ache you need me to examine? Need you to bend over?" She shook her head. "I don't think you're going to get a new one by me. The men around here can be desperate. I would think they would try harder to impress you." "The bar hasn't been set too high," she turned to keep walking. "Then how about a name?" he called after her. She didn't slow, and he watched as she reached a small side street, no more than an alley between buildings, and turned into it. Sterling shook his head and finished his coffee. Maybe his first day of no duty would involve a little bit of exploration. Chapter. Sterling paused outside of the sliding door at Z's. It was a shithole. A simple place for a simple man to get a drink, and nothing fancy. Beer wasn't ordered by name, neither was the rotgut served in different shades of color. The patrons knew the selection was limited to what was on hand and didn't bother the bartender with anything as paltry as details. He stepped through the door and moved to one side to let his eyes adjust. The inside of Z's was grungy. Smoking wasn't allowed in the Martian colony, but that didn't stop the walls from looking yellow with stain and a haze floating on the tepid air. The bartender glanced up from reading a tablet, scowled at the interruption. Sterling raised one finger and pointed to the tap. He got a dirty glass full of piss-yellow liquid that struggled to foam under the faint light. He sniffed it. "Go on," said a voice from the back of the uncrowded room. "It's safe." Sterling took a sip. It was as warm as the room, flat and bitter, with an aftertaste of some fuel-based liquid. He shuddered down a grimace. "It's that bad," the voice said again. Sterling took that as an invite and walked across the few short steps to the back, carrying his beer in one hand, the other resting on his belt. "The way you're holding onto that holster is like a baby clinging tight to that blanket," said the man. "You got a lot of experience with babies?" Sterling set his drink down on the table but stayed a step away from the edge. "Nothing to speak of, not at all," the man said. "You're the Marshal." It was a statement, not a question. Sterling nodded. "Should I know you?" "I suspect we know a few people between us," said the man. "Chuck." He held out his hand. The Marshal looked at it for a moment, then took his hand from his belt and gave it a quick shake. "Now we are acquainted," said Chuck. "Care to have a seat?" Sterling pulled a chair away from the next table, so he could sit with his back toward the wall and angled toward Chuck, his right hand resting on his leg where it met his hip. "You know it says something about a man who won't sit with his back toward a door," said Chuck. "Does it?" "I'm telling the truth," Chuck said. "What does it say?" "It says that man has trust issues." "You could say that," said Sterling. "I just did. Now tell me, Marshal, do you have trust issues?" Sterling tipped back his hat and watched the room. "Something like that." "Something like that or exactly that," Chuck mused with a half-smile as he studied the man beside him. "Never mind, Marshal, I take the measure of a man by his actions and not his words. Good thing too, because you seem to me to be a man of few." "So I've been told." "What is the occasion that brings you into this particular establishment on this particular day? What's a guy like me doing in a place like this? I must confess, I have used that very line or one so similar only a linguist could tell the difference on more than one occasion. Is that why you're here, Marshal? Are you trolling for some afternoon delight?" "No offense, Chuck. You're not my type." Chuck chuckled and eased both hands flat onto the table. "I was about to tell you that you were barking up the wrong tree, but this here situation does not hold a particular smell of entrapment." "Nope." "Good," said Chuck. "It was too clumsy and I think my opinion of you would have suffered had it been one." Sterling glanced at Chuck. "Opinions and assholes, Chuck. Everybody's got one, Marshal. Would you mind if I were so bold as to ask you a question?" "Another pickup line?" Chuck sniffed around a smile and picked up his glass again. "Some men have an air about them. Men who have spent time in the service of our colony. Or the country we fought to get away from." "Are you asking if I was one of those men?" "I am." "I was." "As was I." Chuck grinned and held up two fingers toward the bartender. "Let me get the next round. A lot of us end up here, you know." "At this station?" Chuck nodded and took the two overfull glasses of amber-colored liquid from the bartender's hands. He set one in front of Sterling and held his up for a toast. "To the men who fell before us," he said. Sterling picked up his glass and clinked the edge against Chuck. "Brother's gone," he said. Both men tossed back the entire glass. Sterling shivered in his seat as it burned the whole way down. "You get used to it," Chuck croaked. "God, I hope not," said Sterling. "Now that that's behind us, Marshal, I feel compelled to share with you a lesson." "What are you teaching?" "It's a lesson about geography. I fear your time with us is going to grow short." "News to me." "I see it is, and it will be, and if you stay in Backwoods Station, then you will make the news." Sterling looked at the empty glass. He tilted it off the table and rolled it in his left hand, his right still on his thigh. "That sounds like a threat?" Consider it more friendly advice. Like one of your brother-in-arms suggesting you take a vacation at one location over another. Sterling nodded. And if I don't heed that particular advice? Chuck layered over his empty glass. Then you can't be assured of your safety. Even a veteran? Not even then. The Marshal stood and straightened his hat. He sidestepped away from the table. Then I'll thank you for the drink. You're welcome, said Chuck. A parting gift. Sterling almost backed across the room, but managed to keep an eye on the door and on the man sitting at the table at the same time. He made it to the sliding door and slipped out onto the boardwalk. When the door closed behind him, he let go of a breath he didn't know he was holding. Chapter. He heard his name called out across the main street that cut through the center of town and turned, one hand falling to the butt of his blaster on instinct. Sterling. Sterling Jennings. Ava Crowley strolled across the street like she owned half of it, and he supposed that in truth, she did, though most of it was through the portal of the two buildings behind her. Hello Ava, he tipped his hat with his free hand, the other never leaving the belt just above his holster. Have your ears been burning, Sterling? Because I've been thinking about you. Not any more than usual, he said and glanced over her shoulder. Good thoughts, I hope. Maybe a few dirty ones, she winked. I'll take what I can get. Have you seen Chuck lately? I was hoping I would run into you, she said and hooked her arms through the crook of his elbow, making sure to take his left arm so the right hung free over his holster. Feels more like a plan than hope. Well, a girl can't leave everything to chance, can she? I suppose not. I'm about to get into that bar and get myself a drink. Would you like to join me? She pointed to the bar across the street. Like most of the buildings in Backwoods Station, it was prefab polycarbonate and modular. Whatever was cheap, easy and durable made its way to Musk on ships that charged by the kilo. Once planetside, the colonists were allowed to decorate how they chose, and most chose to ignore the outside accents and accoutrements that their earthbound cousins and counterparts found necessary to get through life. This meant each building looked much like the next, except where wear and tear mandated replacement. Or some hothead burned it down for four walls to rise from the ashes. And while the inhabitants of Backwoods Station adopted the habit of Spartan building exteriors, they did splurge on signs. Each building was marked with a name to indicate what went on behind the pneumatic doors, each designed to operate as an airlock in the case of dome breach, and most employed graffiti artists to artistically share to the station the name of the business. Doby's was no exception. The black letters were surrounded by a swirl of neon colors, shadows of the rainbow scrawled over the door in an easy-to-read sprawl. Sterling waited for the doors to swish open at their approach, then stood aside to let Ava enter first. The inside was dim, LED lighting ran along the upper edge of the wall to bounce soft light off the ceiling. A long bar ran the length of the room and made an L shape to spread along the rear of the place. High-top tables with mismatched chairs were lined up in neat rows, easier for the serving staff to navigate even when the place was packed. Sterling looked around, sizing up the room, mapping the exits and wondering as he did why his mind was the type to measure and assess every person in the room, along with a plan to kill them if it was necessary. It wasn't. He followed her to a table in the back and appreciated the view along the way. Ava moved with a feline grace, her sense of confidence and poise drew every eye in the room. He pulled out a chair and offered her a seat. A gentleman? She smirked as she settled in. Blame the hat, he said as he tipped it back. I'll take what I can get out here. He ordered 2 bourbons, or at least what passed for it in the bar. How do they get it brown? He turned the glass around in his hand as he studied the liquid inside. Tea, said Ava. They use tea leaves to stain the hooch. And people make fun of me for wasting space on the hat? The British contingent in Musk wouldn't open up without their tea. And it makes its way out here. Honey, she said. Anything you want makes its way out here. And you? I came out here the old-fashioned way, she told him. Mama followed Daddy when he went to work in the mines. After Daddy died, she stayed here. She took a quick drink of the homemade shine to hide what she was going to say next. Now? She's dead, she gulped and wouldn't meet his eyes. Happens a lot out here. Women dying. He studied her face for a few moments, trying to read the expression resting there. I can't imagine it would be too easy on a woman. Lots of rough men used to rough lives. She nodded. I'd call it frontier life, but there's nowhere to go past the dome. 1,000,000 miles of desert, maybe. We're not on the front of nothing. Sterling raised his glass. We'll make new frontiers in friendship, he said. That's sweet, she toasted back. I have my moments. I hope you have more than a moment? She lifted up one eyebrow. For you, I'll make an exception, he grinned back. They ordered another round. This place, she shook her head and played with the glass on the table. She tilted in the bottom edge, rolled it back and forth in tiny semicircles that made a soft burring sound against the synthetic wood grain. The amber liquid trapped inside sloshed with emotion, a rolling tide of homemade hooch. Sterling glanced around. It's got that feel, he said. Ava looked up and saw him, then waved her arms to indicate the prefabricated walls that surrounded them. Not this place, a grin lit up her face like a promise as her arm circled wider to add on the space beyond the walls. This place. He heard the emphasis on the word this, heard the hard click of her pink tongue on white teeth and watched as it slipped out and wet her plump bottom lip. This place, he used the same kind of emphasis. Is just like 100 more just like it. Hell, 1,000. He pointed at the wall over his shoulder with a calloused thumb. I'm from one of them, a place worse than this. Little shithole pockets of desperate rock pockmarking the desert. Digging in the dirt for whatever we need to make musk run. Yeah, slurred Ava, the now empty glass making new half-moon crescents and little droplets of wasted liquor. They get it all. And we get this place. Her indignation made him laugh, or maybe it was the way her eyes watched him from under the fringe of hair that crept across her forehead. This place, she took his smile for encouragement. You know what would happen if they shut the mine down? He nodded. He did. They shut down where I was. Before here? Where I'm from. She studied the crescent shapes on the synthetic wood top with a practiced eye. What happened? About what you would expect. He tilted his head back and took a sip of his drink. It couldn't quite be called a burn all the way down. Burn would indicate a warm, pleasant feeling that radiated from the center. This was a searing hot explosion of alcohol-fueled numbness. It's got a kick, don't it? She giggled. Don't they all? I expect that times got hard after the mine left, she said. Yep. Anyone who had money or sense go the hell out. Where did that leave you? Broken senseless? Not like I had much choice. Hell, I was just a kid. This place ain't much for family. No, it's not. It wasn't there either. I got good at being bad, and then I got out in the army. Folks around here call that a mine war. Yeah, we called it that too. Martian independence my ass. People fighting over the shit in the ground. Amen brother. A voice called out from the shadows around them. Sterling searched a moment for the shouter, but no one volunteered. Not very private in here, is it? He said. You want a little privacy, Marshal? Ava grinned. I could invite you over to my house one night for a proper supper. They make those in this place? You might be surprised what we can do in this place to pass the time. Then I think I'll say yes. It's a date, she beamed and waved over another round. You become a marshal after the army? Something like that. They found out I could shoot pretty good, and it just kind of turned into something from there. And you shot that man in Musk? The important one? That little shit? Hell, he thought he was important. But he was connected? That's what people are saying. Sterling's eyes grew hard, the skin around them tightened. Are they? It's just rumors, she said. Like how he got in power and stuff. I don't know if it's true. He watched her a moment more, wondering if she had asked him to dinner just to get his guard down, and dismissing it. Wondering then if the people connected to the man were going to make the trip out to Backwoods Station to pay him a visit. A part of him hoped they would. He wasn't even the slightest bit ashamed that it was a big part. Chapter. You want to join me for a drink? Sterling glanced at the digital clock on the wall. It was set to local time, with 3 other zones represented in separate readouts, red numbers buzzing. A little early for that? Pete pulled his coat off the back of his chair and slung his arms through. We've been at it for a few hours, he answered and started walking to the door. He didn't wait for Sterling to join him. It's 6 a.m. Yeah, we got a couple of calls last night about a threat to the Marshal service. Someone made a threat to the station house. It's a small town, Sterling. People talk. Word travels fast. What does that word say? That Chuck Crowley said some things about you. To me. Excuse me? He said things to me. And about you. I didn't mix my words. Chuck indicated he wanted me to leave Backwoods Station. Indicated, huh? It was a pretty strong suggestion. Pete led him out onto the boardwalk and across the street to a simple one-room structure. This is almost like our break room, said Pete as he plopped in a seat and waved at the man in the back corner. The white-haired geriatric reached up and pressed a button. The table between the two marshals buzzed open to reveal a small bar set, a bottle and 6 glasses. "The good stuff," said Pete as he sloshed the liquid into 2 glasses. "I don't know if you're worth it yet." Sterling and his boss took a sip at the same time. He smacked his lips. "And where do you land around that suggestion?" "I figure he's serious." "Chuck Crowley seems like a serious kind of person. You planning to leave?" "Should I?" "I think you need to keep it on the table as an option." Sterling eased back in the pub seat, the comfortable solidity of the wall behind him. The slurry mix tried to a rock-hard wall, and he felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease up. The wall would stop bullets if anyone decided to take a shot at him. He wondered about the men he was up against and grinned. "What's got you grinning?" "I'm thinking about the men I'm up against. The wording I mean. Like we're a couple of U.S. Marshals and this is the Wild West back on Earth." His boss shook his head and dipped into his drink again. "No, I think you have the right of it. Up against is the correct word. Or maybe up to your neck in shit." Sterling nodded. "Kind of feels like that, don't it? Any idea on how you plan to paddle out of it?" "I think that's a different metaphor." "Well, excuse my mixing, but I think a fella up to his neck in shit creek without a paddle shouldn't really give a damn about how it's delivered. Find a way out of it." Sterling took a sip of moonshine and let it burn down. "I would say I am open to suggestions, but your suggestion would be to get the hell out of Dodge," they finished together. "You don't seem like the kind of man to listen to sound reason." Pete watched him across the table. Sterling noted the lines at the corners of his eyes, and wondered if it was a gift of the Galactic Marshal Service to make men squint so much that it carved reminders into their flesh. Or perhaps it was the Martian sunlight, tinted shades of red and orange by the swirling clouds of dust that worked their way across the face of the planet. No trees to keep it still, nothing to block the wind as it carried off tiny pieces of grit and spun it up into twirling sand blasters, bouncing grit off rocks and breaking both down into finer grains that still could strip flesh from bone if not for the protection of the dome. "Might be smart to take the next train out of here," Sterling mused. Pete let him stew in silence for a few moments as he mulled it over too. "Seems like things are in motion," he said finally. "Seems like you leaving is like running after you kicked up that hornet's nest and you'd be long gone and too far out to get stung. That would still leave a lot of people here on the south side of a stinger." "Yep. That an option? Leaving folks to clean up a mess of my own making? Somehow it don't feel right." "I was hoping that was your answer," said Pete. "Still don't know what to do about it though." "Sleep on it. Maybe a cup of Jamil's in the morning will knock something loose in whatever it is you keep under that hat." Sterling drained his glass and patted Pete on the shoulder once as he stood up and made his way to the door. Chapter. "You want to walk me home?" She slurred and leaned against him a little more than maybe she needed to. He thought it was okay because she felt nice. Solid and warm and soft against him. He may even have leaned back a little, just to let her know that propping up on him was okay. "I don't know if that's a good idea," his mouth said. He tried to think of a way to detach it from his body and throw it on the red clay Martian dirt for betraying him like that. The rest of his body wanted to walk. Wanted a lot more than that, if he was being honest, and the homemade hooch really made him want to be honest. Ava had some ideas of what to do with that errand mouth and leaned in for a kiss. It was slow and hot, her breath mixing with his, her lips tasting of alcohol and cinnamon, which he supposed might be her lipstick. "It's not far," she whispered in a breathless kind of way that made him feel a little short on breath himself. "Well, look at what we have here," said a shadow as it detached from the edge of a building. Sterling's hand drifted to his holster. "Now hold on, Marshal," a second shadow added its voice as it drifted in from a different direction. He held on. The buzz from the home brew was gone, the excitement from a moment before eclipsed into tension. He could feel Ava next to him, still breathing hard as adrenaline dumped into her system, fight or flight arguing over what to do next. He put his left hand on her arm, to anchor her in place, to remind her he was there. "I suppose you boys are armed," he said, eyes flicking from one patch of darkness to the other. "Chuck told us to keep an eye on you," said one of the men. His shadow was shorter, smaller than the other. Wider too, which Sterling liked. It made center mass easier to hit. He was worried about Ava though. What would she do when he started shooting? If she bolted, she might move into his line of fire, might take a shot from one of the outlaws standing in the opening of the alley, like 2 points on a triangle where the couple made a third. She might get hit anyway, if they had their guns up and ready. "He did?" Sterling said. "Where is old Chuck?" Like they were friends. A couple of chums just catching up on an absent member. "Don't you worry none about where he is," said the wide one. "You're gonna find out soon enough." He yanked Ava with his left hand, pulling her down, knocking her below his squat. She yelped as she crashed into the dirt, and he drew. Low and fast, barrel barely out of the holster. Aimed to hit just off center mass, because he wanted the men alive. He was half right. Her yelp had warned the second, who flinched. Fast enough to put his heart in the line of fire, a millimeter or so. The first one went down squealing. The second one dropped, his heart a smoking crater in his chest. Sterling helped Ava up and left her standing. So far, no one had come out to look. As if shootings were common, and two men being blasted down in an alley was just another night in Backwoods Station. Sterling tapped his badge on his belt. "Madge?" But she didn't answer. The first man squirmed on the ground, moaning. Sterling used the tip of his boot to hold him still and check the wound. Just to the right of center mass, exactly where he aimed. Like he'd been taught. Like he had pulled thousands of times at the range, and more than once on a live target. "You'll live," he said to the man on the ground. "If you tell me where he is." "Man, I need a hospital," the muscle groaned. "Call me an ambulance." "You'll get help when I get what I need," Sterling growled. The heel of his boot pressed down on the flesh just below the blasted wound. A laser seals the wound when it passes through flesh, no chance of bleeding out. If it misses the vital organs, it's almost like a flesh wound. It's also like a golf ball-sized ball of light passing through muscle and tissue. It creates a bruise the size of a dinner plate around the wound. And it hurts. The nerves in the actual wound are dead, burned away by superheated plasma. Not so lucky for the rest of the ones in the area. They're extra sensitive, as if they need to make up for their missing nervous system brethren. The heel worked. The man squealed and screamed his yes. Sterling helped him up, held him steady while he found his feet, then prodded him with the tip of his blaster to lead the way. "I need to take him into the station," said Sterling. Ava shook his hand off her arm. "I'm okay," she stuttered, sober now from the adrenaline and fright. "I know my way." "I'm sorry," he said as he led the would-be assailant away from the alley. Chapter. I didn't leave the lights on. She stared at the LEDs that led in a line along the ceiling toward the cooking area in the back. "Come on in," a voice called out. Ava froze as the door slid closed behind her. "It's my house," she snapped. Chuck stepped out of the small cooking alcove wearing her apron and holding a pot in one arm. He stirred with a wooden spoon. "I'm making dinner." She took a step back from the door. His dropped the spoon and whipped a gun from the back of his pants. "Don't hurt my feelings," he told her. He motioned with the tip of the blaster to the table. Ava walked to the chair and sat down. "Why don't you fix us a couple of drinks?" Ava moved in the direction he indicated, fear making her stumble. "What are you doing here?" she stuttered. "Why, I'm making dinner for my brother's widow," he smiled, blaster still pointed in her general direction. "What if I'm not hungry?" "Like I said, don't hurt my feelings. I'll take some of that homebrew on the rocks." He watched her drop 3 cubes of ice into each glass and splash moonshine over the top of them. Chuck held out his hand and waited for her to bring one to him. "Join me in the kitchen?" He waved her into the tiny alcove that housed her food replicator and pantry. The replicator was broken, and a propane camp stove sat on top of it, a cast iron skillet roasting meat over the flame. "As you can see, I had to make do with the ingredients provided," he said. "Your kitchen, like many others in this part of Mars, is broken." She nodded and held her glass to her bottom lip but didn't take a sip. "I took the liberty of making one of my brother's favorites," Chuck said. He stuck his gun in the waist of his pants and tended the meat frying in the pan. "I'm afraid I didn't know your favorite meal or I would have made that instead." "Why are you here?" Ava blurted out. "I mean besides making me dinner." "I can see that. What do you want?" Chuck turned and spooned pieces of meat onto 2 waiting plates. He arranged the presentation and handed her one. "Let's carry this into the dining area, shall we?" She moved to the table and sat down with the plate in front of her. Chuck sat opposite of her and began tearing small chunks from the meat on his plate and popped it into his mouth. "I don't know if it's as good as Mama's fried chicken," he smacked his lips. "But considering what I had to work with, I'd say not too bad, myself. What do you think?" "I think I want you to tell me why you're here." "Try your dinner." "I ain't trying nothing," she snapped. He slammed his hand on the table. It made both plates jump and rattle. Ava let out a small squeak of terror. "I made your dinner," Chuck seethed. "You can do me the kindness of at least trying it." His voice was low and steady. Ava could have handled screaming. That's how his brother would have done it, yelled so loud it shook the walls and scared the neighbors. But she could gauge the threat by the sound of his voice. With Chuck, it was just hard to tell. The man sounded so calm all of the time, his voice mellow, his actions controlled and deliberate. Even now, eyes blazing as if her refusal to eat was an insult that couldn't be tolerated, he sounded calm, cool and collected. That terrified her. She took a bite of the meat and made a grunt of pleasure just for him. "Now that's more like it." Chuck grabbed his and resumed eating. "Ava," he said around a mouthful. "My brother was not kind to you. For that I apologize. I should have stopped him. I should have stood up for you, and I owe you a debt that I fear I may never be able to repay." She nodded and waited for him to say more as she took another bite. "The debt I owe you is one I take seriously. And I'm here to pay that debt as your protector, your provider and as a new suitor when you are ready to start a new life." Ava almost spit out her bite of food. "You made me dinner to court me?" Chuck nodded. "Now look, I know that may seem a little bit old-fashioned, but out here on the edge of nothing as we are, the old-fashioned ways may be some of the best ways. I failed as my brother's keeper but I'm willing to pick up all the duties he left off." "Duties?" She pushed the plate back and crossed her arms over her chest. "You think you're coming near me?" "I am near you, Ava." The communicator over the door sounded. Both of their eyes swiveled in that direction, but the monitor flickered and refused to show them who stood outside. "What's he doing here?" "It's my house," she snarled. "I can invite whoever I want over." "Woman, my brother ain't even in the ground a week and you're inviting strange men over to your house." "It's Mars, dummy. We don't put anybody in the ground. Right now your brother is space dust floating off toward some black hole somewhere." Her words seemed to pain him, as if the thought of his brother gone tickled the edge of his memory, tinged with regret and recrimination. Then the look disappeared from his face, replaced with hard eyes and a thin line where his mouth once was, his lips were compressed so tight. "Let him in." Chapter. The door whisked open and Sterling stepped inside. He saw Ava standing at the far end of the room and started to smile when a voice at the table next to him wiped it from his face. "Sterling Jennings, what a pleasant surprise." Sterling tried to turn and keep it casual, his hand falling toward his waist. It wasn't quite on his holster, but close enough that he could feel the smooth polished grip if he uncurled his fingers. "Chuck. Why, you're just in time for dinner, I guess. If Ava had told me we were having a guest, I would have said another place." "I don't want to impose," Sterling said. He wanted to look at Ava, wanted to study her face, check her eyes to see if this was all an elaborate setup, or if she was scared. The fact was, he was a little scared himself. It was an old fight-or-flight reflex, some sixth sense that kept him alive during the war, and perhaps many times after. He knew what it was. Danger on the air. Maybe it was pheromones, those chemical secretors that people put out when they're attracted to one another and also when emotions run high. Situations fraught with danger meant high emotions. He wondered if he was picking it up from Ava, or the man at the table. "Nonsense, son, come on in and pull up a chair." Chuck kept his right hand on the table next to the blaster and motioned with his left. Sterling moved to the vacated seat where Ava had sat and faced Chuck. "Ava, why don't you get the man a fresh plate?" His finger tapped the table, dangerously close to the blaster trigger aimed in their direction. Ava backed into the kitchen alcove, afraid to turn her back on the man. "This here is good cooking," said Chuck. "I made it myself while I was waiting on Ava to come home." "You living here now?" "Well now Sterling, I think it's a man's duty to care for his brother's widow, and you know the type of man I am when it comes to duty. I'm not one to shirk it." "I suppose. Which begs the question. Why are you calling on my brother's widow? Is she still under the protection of the Marshal service?" "She is. And yet when I arrived, there wasn't a GM to be seen. Not in the front, not in the back. In point of fact Sterling, no Marshal has made his or her presence known until you buzzed the communicator like the big bad wolf come huffing and puffing on her door." "I didn't huff." "I guess you didn't. You're going to like what I made," said Chuck. "It won't take you back to your army days I'm afraid. I didn't have shit to reheat over a shingle, but I think you'll find it will do in a pinch." Ava stepped through the door with a steaming pot grasped between two mittens on her hands. "Ava, serve the man," said Bonnie. "This is going to be his last meal in Backwoods Station before he meets the train." "Can't leave," Sterling said. There won't be a train for a week. We really going to go down this road? You're driving Hoss. You know my Sarge called me Hoss, Chuck growled. I hated that fucker. His hand moved fast. Faster than a snake. Sterling was faster. His blaster cleared the holster in a simple smooth movement that left the barrel of the weapon just out of the leather and pointed over the edge of the table. A red blast of superheated air seared the air between them. Chuck yelped a grunt and flipped over onto the burnished floor. You shot him. Sterling let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Hell yeah, I shot him, he said in a voice just above a whisper. Son of a bitch was going to shoot me. You shot him, she repeated. He glanced up at her and saw wide eyes over a pot of steaming beans, the hot air off the dish making wavy lines of steam in front of her face. She was in shock, or on the verge of it, which surprised him. You've seen a man shot before, Sterling said and stood up from his chair to go check on Chuck. You shot one. Yeah, but I didn't watch it. You didn't watch? I had my eyes closed. Lucky shot, Sterling muttered. He kneeled beside Chuck. The man was staring at the ceiling, mouth gaping open and closed like a fish out of water. Sterling tapped the communicator in his badge. Badge number 1111, he announced. I need a medical unit to converge on my signal. Who is this? The cracked wizened voice squeaked through the device. 1111 Maud, Sterling said. It's Sterling. The new one? Yeah, it's the new one. What do you want? How am I supposed to know it's you if you don't say who you are? I gave you my badge number, he started to explain. That ain't your name, she cut him off. And besides, you think I've got those memorized? There's only two of us, Sterling explained. 11 and 1111. How was I supposed to know it was you? Maud, he said, and it came out a little sharper than he meant. Do you know how to locate my position with the transponder? Are you calling me stupid? No. 'Cause I'm sitting here looking at the computer monitor and I can see plain as sunlight exactly where you are. Then send a medical unit here. We've got a man shot. Shot? Who shot him? I did. Another one? Just send the unit. He turned away from Chuck and motioned Ava to take the chair he had just vacated. Sit down before you faint. She watched him pull a fallen napkin off the floor and pressed it to the sealed wound in Chuck's torso. I don't think I hit anything major, he said to the man. But you never can tell what with the angles and all. Everything in there's burned shut on account of the laser, but that don't mean it's all right. Chuck mouthed wordless noise in his general direction, eyes still locked on the ceiling. Hang tight, Sterling said. Help's on the way. Chapter. Just to be clear, you shot another one. Yep. Again. Was that last one a question? Did it sound like a question? Pete snapped. Your voice went a little high on the end. Lots of folks do that when they're asking a question they already know the answer to. Who do I look like, Socrates? I don't ask questions I know the answer to, Sterling. Hell, that defeats the whole point of questions in the first place. I don't know, you might be trying to turn this into a teaching moment. Now what the hell am I going to teach a trigger-happy blast man stuck in my station? I'm not stuck, Pete. You can send me back to Musk. I tried, said his boss. They won't take you. Said the powers that be want you out of the picture, and if they can't have you dead, they'll have you out of the way. Way out here, huh? Face it, Sterling, you're damn good at pissing people off. It's a gift. The two men stood in front of Ava Crowley's as medics loaded Chuck into the back of a hover wagon. You didn't kill him though. Nah, said Sterling. He's just lucky, I guess. Blast radius 3 inches from center mass, burned a hole right by his heart. The man was pining for his brother's ex-wife, said Sterling. I figured he had enough heartache. Widow, corrected Pete. What did I say? Ex-wife. She's a widow. Self-made widow. Self-defense. So she claims. You don't believe her? Sterling asked. Doesn't matter what I believe, Marshal. Only matters what the MA can prove in court. Galactic marshals collect the bad guys, the Martian attorneys try to put them away. I believe her. I bet you would. That's supposed to mean something? Yeah, Sterling, I think it means that you're the kind of man that's going to look for any excuse to justify sleeping with a material witness and murderess. Alleged. Alleged murderess. And I haven't slept with her. Don't brag about your sexual prowess to me, Pete grumbled. No, it's true, said Sterling. There's just been dinner. Bullshit. A woman that looks like that? With a man like you? Hasn't happened, said Sterling. Who you trying to convince? Pete said as he watched the medics pull away. You coming? I'll be along, said Sterling. Just gonna make sure she locks up safe. Pete shook his head and bit his tongue as he marched away from his deputy marshal. Sterling watched as he rounded the corner and didn't look back. He turned to the door and let himself in without knocking. The end.